Hello and welcome to In a Different League, the official podcast of the original fantasy football game. We're your hosts, me, Chris Pilau.
And me, Jessica Parker-Humphreys.
And this is what you can look forward to in episode 5.
Game week 12 brought us plenty of goals and therefore plenty of fantasy league points, both positive and negative. We take a look back at where things are both from the weekend and the season as a whole as we head into another international break.
James Thomson is our Different League guest in part 2. How does fantasy league and the armed forces mix? We'll find out with him.
And Neil joins us as ever in part 3 along with your questions, queries and a few tips to put you listeners in a different league.
Right, so Jesse, straight after game week 12, we're into the international break, as you say, and what a treat we had over the weekend, ending with Chelsea Man City, which will be an obvious talking point, and a game which I think will have affected many managers. Not me. I got 12 points over the weekend, and I only had Bernardo Silva playing in that game, so I had a big smile on my face just watching everything happen and watching lots of teams fall apart. But how did you get on over the weekend?
I'm still in this slump, Chris. I got 5.
Ooh.
So I still have Robert Sanchez in goal. So they were sort of my minus points coming out, Chelsea City. But it could have been worse because John Stones is obviously injured. So he wasn't playing. I got some sort of points from strange sources over the weekend. I got a goal from William Saliba, which was much needed. I haven't had a goal for a while at this point. An assist from Pedro Porro, which inured me against the eventual Spurs defeat that came sort of out of nowhere in that Saturday lunchtime kickoff. But it's getting tight at the top. My sister has had an insane month, 43 points. She's now only 20 behind me.
Another Jackson goal for her as well.
Mm.
And look, you prove from you that defenders do score points, despite what everyone else is saying so far this season. And yeah, Chelsea Man City then, to start with, it was the most recent game of the weekend. For you, what was that like? You can talk a bit more generally as well, what it's like to watch a Premier League game as a fantasy league manager. But obviously as a Chelsea fan as well, the emotions kind of in that game, we spoke about it last week with the Tottenham match. What was it like for you? So you obviously had Sanchez in goal, but you've got Alvarez, right, as well. Who else did you have playing in that game? And what was it like to watch that game from those two different perspectives?
Yeah, so I just had Sanchez and Alvarez. My other Chelsea player, who I'm still patiently waiting for, is Christopher Nkunku. Just as a spectacle, it was crazy. Some context is that I was on the train back from Liverpool. I'd gone to Chelsea women's away game in Everton, which was freezing. But I was on a train full of Liverpool fans because their game against Brentford had just finished. So it was a stress to get a seat, but I did. I was there. I was able to sit down I was alternating between watching it on my phone, but then when the signal would cut out, I'd switch on to BBC Sounds so I could get the radio and sort of having this back and forth, which made it even crazier to try and follow what was going on. But it was a fantastic game. And I think from a just Chelsea fan perspective, both those games that sort of happened across the last 7 days, the Spurs one and then the City one, it just feels like the team obviously aren't the finished article, but to go and sort of create the chaos and score 8 goals. I can't remember the last time Chelsea scored 8 goals across basically 7 days. It's been so dull in attack for so long. And I know the Spurs one, there's a big sort of asterisk on where those 4 goals came, but it's been a very, very enjoyable week. And yeah, if you told me we'd score 4 against Man City, I would have bitten off your hand for that even before. And Cole Palmer at the end, I was saying, wasn't I, Chris, the other week? Cole Palmer on those Chelsea penalties, he keeps putting them away.
I know, and he was one of the talking points. Obviously, the defenders, we'll move on to the defenders because that would have affected a lot of fantasy league managers. But from a fantasy league point of view, Chelsea taking their chances is the story. A lot of goals coming from both sides. I mean, Erling Haaland ends up being the top scorer in fantasy league this week, but it kind of wasn't really about him. It was about those Chelsea players who are, I wouldn't say coming good because they have been playing well. They just haven't been putting those chances away. And lots was made, obviously, of Cole Palmer, Raheem Sterling. I've always seen Sterling over the years when he was at Man City as kind of one of the ultimate fantasy league players in that whenever he's got the ball, he loves getting into the box, and you just know he's almost got sort of like a 2-point and a 3-point button over his head. You can almost see it's going to be 2, it's going to be 3, it's going to be 2. But Cole Palmer is the story, and from a fantasy league point of view, from Cole Palmer, I would love to go back. Was he even mentioned at auctions? He probably wasn't. Did anyone buy
He
him as a
wouldn't have
Man
signed
City
for.
player? Exactly, but did anyone buy
Yeah.
him as a Man City player? Does anyone have three? I know it wouldn't work that way, would it? But yeah, was he even in the conversation? And I remember quite well when he did sign for Chelsea, sort of like the ridicule in the Fantasy League WhatsApp group about him as well, being like, well, who's going to go for him? Is he even going to play? And he's completely turned it around. Well, I say turned it around. He's completely done what it looks like he was intending to be doing. But he'll be the top of everyone's shopping list if for whatever reason already that he's not playing in a fantasy league out there.
Yeah, and I think it's not only that he's sort of taking and scoring the penalties, it's his all round involvement in the team and obviously how quickly he's become someone that Pochettino relies on. I mean, it's going to be fascinating to see exactly how that all plays out when Nkunku's back after the international break. But it kind of puts Chelsea in a place where they probably don't have to rush Nkunku back in terms of exactly how they figure out putting all those players together, because it just feels like Palmer is so essential, to even still be on the pitch sort of at that point in the game to take the penalty just shows, I think, how crucial he's become to this side. And yeah, I think also the goal for Jackson, it was like a really nice finish, I thought, in the end. Like, I think it was one of those goals which feels like it should be easy, a bit like some of the Spurs ones, but like I don't think it's easy as it seems. And I feel like that was like such a nice way for him to follow up the hat trick. And these attacking players for Chelsea are starting to find their rhythm and find a bit more confidence in front of goal. And it's going to be really interesting to see the Chelsea games after the international break are Brighton and Newcastle, I think, who are both teams at the moment who, are feeling very, very wobbly. And prior to this run of Chelsea games, they were sort of included as teams that Chelsea should be really worried about playing. But, off the back of drawing with Man City and beating Spurs, I think Chelsea will feel quite confident going into those.
Yeah, you called that a couple of weeks ago when we signalled the run that Chelsea were about to go into, that actually the way they play against those big sides, it reminds me of Liverpool from a couple of seasons ago. Liverpool have been a lot better defensively this season. Arsenal way back when, sort of like, great against the bigger teams, where they can, especially they're playing on the break, they've got a lot more, they can get into the box, they'll be able to run beyond the defenders. But actually it's how they do against the teams who actually put a bit of a defensive block on. And I don't think actually that's going to be the case with Man United and Brighton, so they'll probably be fine. You mentioned Jackson there. Jackson looked like he didn't know how to celebrate. He looked so surprised that actually one of his first shots had gone in. And he scored 4 goals in a week. Brilliant for your sister. Brilliant for all Jackson owners out there. And from a Man City point of view, and we're not just going to talk about this game, but obviously it was such a big game. Man City did look a bit vulnerable, obviously. They looked a bit more sort of like a normal team, in the goals that they were scoring, wide men putting in crosses. They even get a deflected goal. It's interesting with Man City, and you wouldn't have expected those defenders to have conceded so many, and that would have really had an effect on a lot of fantasy league managers out there who are confident with their Man City defenders, whoever they may be. But I do wonder if you're one of these managers who maybe has even doubled up on Man City defenders. Maybe you've got the Edison and another defender, thinking that Man City are going to be one of the most defensive teams, that even they are starting to suffer of this sort of defending happening in the Premier League this season theme.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, to a certain extent, I think you can probably still see this game as just like a pretty crazy blip in terms of City. But I do think, I always talked about the Stones absence because he's in my team, but there is a sense that for City, sort of, I know Rodri played in this game, but, there are these sort of midfielders, basically, who, when they're not available, suddenly City don't seem to have that same level of control that we're so familiar with them. And I think to a certain extent in this game, that was part of Pochettino's game plan. He wanted to make City uncomfortable. He wanted to take the control away from them, and he was just able to sort of unleash chaos and see what happened. And the result was that Chelsea conceded 4 goals as well. So sometimes you've sort of got to play with fire, I think. But yeah, I mean, just generally, Chris, looking across the league as a whole, we had 2 3-2s. Obviously, we had the Spurs-Wolves 2-1. The only teams who kept clean sheets this weekend were Bournemouth, which I don't think many people would have put money on.
Or would have had Bournemouth defenders, probably.
Well, exactly. And Liverpool and United. So I mean, I guess Liverpool and United potentially a bit more predictable, but I just think when you look across all those results, lots of teams that people might be banking on with their defenders are just sort of really struggling to keep clean sheets at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I was happy that Matip was starting for Liverpool. It kind of isn't always the case, and happy to get a clean sheet there. I didn't get a Bournemouth clean sheet. I do have Nick Pope in goal for Newcastle, and I was happy. We've got save points in our league, so I was happy that his 5 saves, which again wouldn't have expected against Bournemouth, meant that I didn't end up getting minus points there against Bournemouth. But yeah, this theme continues. There'll be managers who are frustrated the fact that Villa so dominant at home, 3-0, but then it's actually 3-1. That Arsenal obviously got a man sent off, but are also conceding a goal. It's those goals which are kind of killing a lot of managers out there. And then, and Tottenham, we spoke last week, is it sort of, are Tottenham going to fall apart now with all of those injuries? And you've got to say that they did. It was a combination of two things. Wolves played really well. Wolves are really up for the comeback at the end. It was a brilliant Sarabia goal. I don't know how many Sarabia owners there are out there, but oh my God, that's almost worth an extra point just for the touch alone, let alone the finish that came with it. And it's such a nervy season this season for defensive points, I think. And no Sarabia. I mean, no one owns Sarabia in my league. I don't know what it's like for you, but I did mention Wolves a few weeks ago. That Wolves are the team. Look out for Wolves players. They're playing really well. Even Mario Lemina, someone who is quite a defensive midfielder, but he's getting forward into dangerous positions. He scores the winner. Their press is really impressive. Talking about extra points, the way Gary O'Neill threw the ball to launch a throw in, maybe that's worth half a point, something for Neil in part 3. But there are some teams who I think. We speak lots about the defenders, but actually there are some exciting players out there on attacking sides. You only have to look at what happened at Palace, which also unexpected. 3-2, 5 goals at Selhurst Park. Everton looking attacking. Crystal Palace are looking attacking. Mikalenko, Doucouré, Eze. It can still be a good season for Fantasy League, even if there are defensive points. You can kind of outweigh it with some really nice attacking performances. And maybe Abdoulaye Doucouré, certainly one to look out for. He is playing as a number 10. We're seeing now, actually, that 12 weeks into the season, how some of these teams are setting up, and whether it's under new managers or whether it's under new ways of playing. And Doucouré, as a midfielder, is basically playing as a number 10. He's playing off Calvert-Lewin, and you're starting to see some of those players to target now.
Yeah, I think we're getting to that point of the season, aren't we? Sort of coming up to this November international break where, early on in the season, it's very hard to figure out how good teams are. You get a lot of variance in the league based off being sort of unlucky. I think we've seen that with teams like Chelsea and with teams like Everton, who've sort of performed well but not had results go their way. This kind of becomes the moment where you can sort of start to suss out, okay, like as the season goes on, who's going to sort of rise to the top. Brighton, I guess, are an example that kind of feels like they're heading in the opposite direction. Someone who had this incredibly fast start to the season looked like they were just going to carry on scoring for fun, even if they're a bit defensively open. And now even some of that like attacking flair seems to be drying up a bit more. Obviously, they drew 1-1 with Sheffield United after Modahoud was sent off there. But I feel like these are the kind of moments where you can sort of try and drill into some of those more bottom half of like the top half of the table, if that makes sense, sort of like 6 to 12, which it takes a while for that to really sort of like solidify, doesn't it?
Yeah, and one we always knew he was probably going to do well, James Ward-Prowse at West Ham. I think he's got 9 assists in all competitions this season. That's not all the Premier League. I mean, he got compared to David Beckham on Match of the Day too over the weekend, but perhaps rightly so. I mean, he's brilliant, and those are Fantasy League points. If you're a James Ward-Prowse owner, you know that a lot is going to go through him at West Ham. And there's another example as well. He started strongly, but the West Ham players are only really starting to get to know him now as well. They know how to play with him. The attackers know what to run onto. He's going to be a really big scorer this season, even if it's only assists. I mean, we might see some penalties and some direct free kicks as well. But I think he's a midfielder who is going to score a lot of goals. And Aston Villa are looking like, right, away from home, it's obviously not as good as at home, but at home now, yet another game where they score 3 goals plus at home. I think that is the 6th consecutive home game where they scored 3 plus. it's entertaining, it's free, it's really loud at Villa Park. If you've got Aston Villa players, then you are really happy when they're playing at home. It also made me think with Unai Emery, like how can a manager be that good? Because obviously he is really good. How he's bringing out the best out of some of these players that he's brought in, players that were already there. And it made me think, Jesse, that firstly, he would be a brilliant fantasy league manager. But kind of what managers would be good at fantasy league? And he would be up there. I also think that maybe like Guardiola, Klopp perhaps wouldn't. They'd probably spend a lot at the auction on the big players. The best right back from Ligue 1 has just come in, and Guardiola would, spend all his budget on it. And I think Emery would be great. And kind of like, what are the characteristics? Someone like Harry Redknapp would be brilliant from days gone by. Or rather, I think I'm a bit like Harry Redknapp in kind of going for familiar players. I'd always go for players who've done well in the past. The way that he'd go after like Nico Cranchar and Peter Crouch. That's what I do with my teams. But it did make me think. Does any names spring to mind for you? Like what real managers would make good fantasy league managers?
I definitely agree Guardiola would be bad. He would be the person who was sort of putting players on the subs bench who you're just like, just keep them in your team. And he's like, no, this is like the specific formation I need this week. This I think is going to do well. And then his bench is absolutely full of points. The man who sprung to mind, which I guess comes similarly from your Harry Redknapp shout, is Sean Dyche. Not so much in terms of going for familiar players, but just being like, I know this player's a banker. I'm not going to go for like the glitz and the glamour. I'm just going to go for players who I think are going to get me 20 to 40 points. And that's what I'm interested in. I'm not interested in going for someone who's going to sort of get 60, 70 over the season. I just want to fill my team with 15 solid guys.
Yeah, it's a tight squad of players, full of players that play sort of like 80 minutes every week as well. They're not even going to get subbed off in their game. But it's also the sort of like the personality that comes with it. Another reason Klopp and Guardiola wouldn't be great is they'd be so unbearable in the WhatsApp chat after a game when things don't go bad. I mean, it would be nice to see, but it would get quite spicy as well. They'd actually perhaps not be that nice. The dynamic in the league wouldn't be that great if they were in a bad mood.
How fed up would you be when you had a bad week and Ange Postecoglou's going to you, oh, it's all right, mate, it is what it is?
I think that would be fine. You'd be like, at least he's taking it well. I think that Mourinho would be brilliant. Mourinho would definitely, he would have a lot of defending points. He'd be someone who'd double up on defensive points. So he'd have like 2 Newcastle defenders and get sort of like 9 points out of it one week. But he'd also somehow have found out a way to have 3 Newcastle defenders by having someone who transferred over. He'd give so much chat in the WhatsApp group and he'd be really, really good value to play with. So anyway,
coming to the pub at the end of the season with his fingers on his lips, shushing everyone as he walks in after winning.
Yeah, and he'd be holding up sort of like 8 fingers, being like all the trophies he'd won that season because of the Manager of the Month awards that he'd picked up along the way.
He would definitely count trophies. Manager of the Month as a trophy.
So anyway, it's a good talking point. Maybe one for our listeners to get in touch with. What Premier League managers or any football manager would make good fantasy league managers? And maybe there is even one out there who's playing. If you know of an ex-manager who's playing Fantasy League, then please do get in touch. All the usual places, as you usually can, at Fantasy League on social media and podcast at fantasyleague.co.uk if you really want to go to town and tell us about the characteristics of all the football managers out there. So that's it for part 1. We won't be looking ahead to the next round of fixtures. We'll leave that for the international break episode coming up next week, where we can also take a look back at the best players and worst players of the season so far. That's it for part 1. We'll see you in part 2 for our next guest interview.
Welcome back to part 2 of In a Different League, and today we are joined by James Thomson to talk us through his league. James, great to have you here with us today. To kick us off, just give us a little bit of an intro on your league and how you got into Fantasy League in the first place.
Thanks, Jesse. Thanks, Chris, for inviting us on. Yeah, so our league is currently called and has been for a long time the Butcher's Hook and Cleaver League, famously after said pub in Farringdon in London. So a classic pub-named league for obvious reasons. I'm another one of these originals. Started as an 18-year-old student in halls, 93, 94. got I think the Daily Telegraph. The Daily Telegraph was the one that sponsored it for the first time, and it had this thing called Fantasy League Classic. There's your players, there's the budget, pick a team and compare with your mates. So we did all that for a few years through my uni years. And we had like some of your previous guests had said, you post your transfer, and it was a Wednesday. Wednesday was D-Day because that was when the list was published and updated. So you put your transfer in, you waited till next Wednesday, saw how you'd got on, and then you watched the games at the weekend. From the Classic came the auction version. So by the time the auction version of the same company came out, we'd been doing it, I don't know, 6-7 years or something. We all said, we've got to do this. Let's meet in a pub. Did this first attempt at an auction and went from there, really. So about 2001, 2002, I think, was the first time we actually did the auction version, and got all excited because we realised, so I would be the only one with Thierry Henry. Awesome. 50 million. And then the sort of tactics came 2 or 3 seasons later when we realised actually how to play it, and you weren't, doing all those classic early mistakes of blowing all your budget way too early.
What else do you remember about that first auction? I mean, yeah, Thierry Henry probably was one of those players. Do you remember anything else about that first auction? Like you say, you didn't really know what you were doing. And is there anything that has kind of stayed from those early auctions that you're still doing now?
Yeah, a couple of things. Firstly, when you look at today, the difference back in those days, there were a lot more premiums, what we would call a premium. If you think back in those late 90s, early 2000s, you had Ender, Letitia, Shearer time, but you had Sheringham, Fowler, Owen, Ferdinand, Giggs, Ian Wright even, Cole, York. There were all these players that were sort of in this version of the game, 60, 70, 80-point players. Your Henrys, Ronaldo's 100-point players. But there were loads of them. Whereas now, if you haven't got Haaland or Salah, who's next? You need that sort of freak
Ollie
season
Watkins
wonder.
is the answer, James.
Ollie Watkins. maybe Son, maybe KDB, but he's injured. It's a completely different world of the not key premium. So that was the difference. But from those early auctions, I sort of slowly developed what I've sort of called my 10 commandments, I guess, of the sort of cardinal rules of the auction.
Oh,
so
does anyone else in your league know them? Or are these your personal 10 commandments?
They may have them in a different name, but yeah. I don't know. So have a top 10 as a basic, have a top list of top 10 players. And I sort of always say, get 2 of them. If you can get 3, you're sorted. Get 2 of your top 10, and that can cover any position. Get at least 1 premium, vital now, because there's so few compared to how they used to be. Never raise in the auction rounds, in the laps, never raise a player you want. Always raise a player to waste money from someone else. And if you can get players that you think will get pushed up, the more money, the better. So that's one. Never have 2 strikers from the same team. If you 4-3-3 formation makes that a little bit less powerful, but when it was we for ages we had only 2 strikers allowed, so that was one. Adhere to talisman theory, i.e. get the players, especially now when it's 100-minute games, who is the talisman, who never gets subbed. It's worth massive now. Buemo, for example, mid-table team, he never gets subbed. He's a brilliant fantasy league player. Fill your bench with strikers, I said earlier. Never pay for a goalie. Goalies are rubbish in this format now. Never pay at the auction. Never buy a goalie. Just get one free at the end.
I think that's easier when you've got smaller leagues as well.
If you get to 12, it's tough. But even your Allisons, Edisons, Popes, they're just worth like 15 points a season, or 20 maybe.
This season, though, but it wasn't like that last season or the season before. It is a sudden change, so...
And what were the last couple? Be patient. Harder said than done. Retain some money for the season. How we do it, we get gate receipts 4 times a year, where you get money back depending on your monthly performance. So you top up your money, and you can use that through the season. And last but not least, stay sober-ish. We have one player classically. He always gets too excited. He turns up an hour early. He's had 3 pints by the time we even start. Within 20 minutes, he's bought the 2 massive players, 20 million each. We only have a 50 million budget. We've stuck to the original 50 million, and he's blown 40 to 45 million in 2 players, and that's him. And he says every
and
year,
then he's got nothing else. Then he has to wait, twiddle his thumbs, and then probably end up
4
drinking
hours.
more,
He's like,
carry on drinking.
Why did I buy? And he bought Van Nistelrooy and Henry one year, which kind of I think almost won in the league for doing that plan, and then he's stuck with that forever. But now he'll buy someone like Grealish or something, a decent player, but he'll pay massively over the odds. He doesn't think, Haaland hasn't even gone yet.
I feel like that kind of going too early or drinking too much is like the longest hangover you can ever have, because you get a season-long hangover.
Exactly.
Fantasy league team.
But there's so much you can pull back in season play with the way the league runs now. transfer window doesn't finish till the end of August, and everyone's auctions are, end of July, early August. So there's going to be issues there. The international breaks mean that actually we're coming up to December now. We've only played 12 games. So the January through to April phase is much more important than the August to December phase.
You allow yourself to have that money generated, to keep that money coming throughout the season as well, which helps.
Yeah, and we get one on the 1st of January, one of those top ups. So December is a Christmas month. So because there's usually about 7 or 8 games in December. Basically, you get 1 million per 15 points you get, and whoever's top or bottom of the league gets a bonus. We created a wooden spoon sympathy million for whoever's bottom at that time, so that you can then bid for players in the January transfer window if they're coming through. So yeah, in season play, you can have a hopeless auction, and if you stay engaged, you can do well. And there's one manager who always finishes last every year, but he loves the auction. He basically lives for the auction, enjoys it, does well, and says, right, this is going to be my year. I'm going to do super subs. I'm going to watch everything, and he never does. He's bottom by 35 points already this year.
Oh dear, that's quite endearing, cute.
Yeah, and he loves it, and he pays the website. He pays our fee. We have a little prize pot.
Tell us about who makes up your league at the moment, because I know you've got some quite far-flung people, or have at least had so in the past.
Yeah, so we've sort of fluctuated from anywhere between 6 or 7 right up to sort of 12 managers. So that, and we always thought a nice number is sort of maybe 8 or 9, 10. We've flirted with the idea of 2 leagues at one point, but stuck with the one. Probably 6 or 7 regular Navy, and then 3 or 4 mates of the various people. So there's 4 or 5 of us who have been friends from school days. There's a Dover Deal gang that's in it, my sort of best mates from home. And then added to that were 4 or 5 Navy mates, 3 or 4 of the sort of city boys that were mates of the others. So we're a mix of basically Dover and Deal, Navy, and random business, finance sector people from London, I guess, have made it up our league. But the Navy ones, always provide a little bit of interest because, right, where's Ollie going to be? Where's Greg going to be this year? And they'll be, I'm deployed overseas, I'm in America, or I'm off the, Baltic coast or something. I've done it from a bridge wing before. I've done it from my cabin in the Atlantic Ocean, and you hope that you maintain your connectivity. It all sort of comes down and trying to get, I think one of your other guests said, how do you get 10 people in a room in 2023? It's a nightmare. So, even in a virtual room, not even a live room, to actually have the live auction now is really challenging, especially for 40-something middle-aged guys and girls that have got families, kids, and all that sort of stuff.
It comes as no surprise now to all the listeners why all that meticulous planning, the 10 commandments going into the auction, that your league is littered with people from the armed forces. You mentioned there those auctions where you've been doing it from a bridge wing, whatever. Is there anything in particular, any particular moment that you remember really being stuck? Perhaps you weren't allowed to, really sneakily getting the phone out, trying to get a bid in, or perhaps from you or one of the other people in your league?
The best moments from the auction are the live ones when we've all been in the room. They've been the fun ones. As long as you've maintained a WhatsApp line, we'll be okay. So there's been some temporary humorous moments where they've gone off, they've come back and argued, whoa, no, I was still bidding for Salah or something like that. And, we're not going to see them off and say, no, too late. So there's been nothing catastrophic from that, but it does provide regular amusement when they're sort of sometimes jump in and out of connectivity. But with WhatsApp's great. I mean, that was a game changer when the invention of WhatsApp allows you to do things that you just couldn't do before. So like what we're doing now, or any sort of Zoom type remote meeting you can't do with the connectivity because you need more bandwidth, but just a WhatsApp line, you can survive.
Disciplined, very organised. What happens if you can't make an auction? Because I've basically put the rule now as league chairman in my league now that's been running a few years, that if you can't make the auction, we're not as organised as you, I don't think. So for me, the auction just has to go ahead without you. We almost have to get someone else in. But if obviously it's going to be quite likely in your league that someone can't make the auction, what happens there?
Yeah, so we had a fairly early decision to have a surrogacy rule where as long as you're happy to play and put your prize money pot into the pot and all that sort of stuff, that you just basically send some instructions to your surrogate, and as detailed or as vague as you like, and hope for the best, essentially. So people have done that many a time, and then it might be something as simple as get me Salah under all, no matter what. That's it. That's the instruction. Or it might be something as detailed as, right, I want 2 of Man United, Man City, Liverpool, Arsenal, blah, 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 blah. And it goes on and on and on. And the more detailed, actually, what happens historically, the manager that is the surrogate ends up cocking up his own team because he's so determined. They're so determined to do the surrogacy part right. And that has happened. And then they rant and rave throughout the season saying, well, it's only because I was a surrogate that I'm not doing so well.
I don't think I could face entrusting, as someone who woke up at 4 a.m. Australia time to make sure I could do my auction this year. I don't think I'd feel safe entrusting my team to someone else. We have done it before, though, in our league. I definitely think now with things like Zoom, it has become easier because you can get up at sort of stupid o'clock and phone in from Australia and things like that.
It's horrible. Yeah, it really is. Like, I've never allowed anyone else to do it for me, but I've done it for someone else. And you're more nervous about their team. You don't want to let them down. You're really stressing. You get, like James says, you end up completely disregarding your own team. But then you're also worried about their team for the whole season. It's kind of like, it really is like surrogacy. There's sort of like this link that you can't ever get rid of.
I feel like you've got your own attachment issues maybe playing out in these teams, Chris. James, I was going to ask, have you ever, what has been your biggest controversies that have sort of come out from your league? Anything that sticks in the mind?
We've had a couple of classics. I mean, my best mate from all my life is my biggest rival. You know, we're both called James. He was James G. I'm James T. You know, from the days of playing board games as kids through everything, we've sort of grown this competitive challenge. So naturally, that's sort of as today it's Sven's Fantasy League. And because of one controversy he did, he will always try and, if he can on a technicality get an advantage, he'll take it. He's ruthless like this. And we created something called the Henri clause as a result of controversy he did back in the day. And effectively, we have a weekly sealed bid. So our sealed bid is every Thursday night, 23:59. Boom, there it is. So a nice weekly one, and it's born out of how we run our gate receipts and money through the season. You can have a weekly one. What he did, and when we sell a player, it goes immediately back into the pot to free agents, and you generate half the money you paid for them. So a fairly simple system there. But he proposed at the start of one season that you can't bid for a player you've just sold for a period of 1 week, and everyone rejected it, saying, "Look, stop making up extra rules. It's too complicated. We don't need that." Okay, he said with a glint in his eye. It was the year Michael Owen had just come back from Madrid. So we're about 05, something like that, 05, 06. But he wasn't available at the start of the season. We knew he was probably coming back. So there was right, let's save some money. Who's going to get Owen? James had got Henri. And then one of the first seal bids in the season, about week 2 or 3, when Owen's in the pool, he waits until 23:58 on Thursday night, sells Henri into the pot, generates the sort of 10 million because he paid 20 million for him. And 1 minute later, he bids for Michael Owen for 10 million. Lo and behold, we process the seal bids the next morning and everyone sees 10 million Michael Owen and he wins it. And, whoa, you didn't have that money. I put Henri back into the pot. No, you didn't. And it just kicked off for about 2 weeks. Everyone was saying, this is outrageous. This is deception, you know, and it was all people threatened to leave. And of course they didn't. It was fine. But from that moment, we then had, the Henri clause became you have to have sold your player back into the pot at 23:59 by the Wednesday night. So you create a 24-hour window. Otherwise, people could always do this, and you wouldn't notice that there was suddenly a valuable asset in the pot for a few minutes. Who's going to stay up till 23:59 just to check that? Well, I might be that person, but people with jobs and lives couldn't do that. So that was definitely the biggest controversy. He bought Henri back for 2 million. Sorry, the missing part that you hadn't. Yeah, so he sold Henri. 1 minute later, he bid for Henri for the minimum price because no one knew he was available. And then with the money he generated from the sale, he also got Owen. So he wakes up the next day.
Yeah, it's very naughty.
And he's got Henri and Owen, and everyone's outraged. So yeah, so the 24-hour Henri clause has lived for about 20 years now.
So James, how are you getting on this season? 20 years on. Who have you got on your team? Who are your big hitters and how's it going?
Well, up until that crazy Man City-Chelsea game at the weekend, I was second. I'm now third. There seems to be as a 3-team runaway, of which James G isn't one. So I'm now third, but I'm only 9 points behind top. So I'm doing okay. There's Ollie, who's fiercely competitive, and he is famous for being the Jimmy White of our league because he has been runner-up 4 times and he's never won. For the younger listeners, Jimmy White is a snooker player and he's never won the World Championship, but he was runner-up like 7 times or something. So Ollie's top. Simon, who's also competitive, he's also almost won a few times but hasn't, is second, and I'm in third, 9 points down. So it's very close. And then there's a bit of a gap. There's about a 30-point gap to the rest. I've actually got a decent team, but I've been hit. I've been unlucky. I'm going to moan about my injuries. So I've managed to have Odegaard and Maddison, both of whom have been out. And Maddison looks like he's out for a while. As a United fan, I know from Kent, right? I've got the massively underperforming Rashford, but I have got Ollie Watkins, Chris, so you'd be happy with that.
Very good.
One of the 10 commandments, which is an obvious one, is
buy Ollie Watkins.
Is fill your bench with strikers, so you can then sell them for a little bit more if they turn out to be rubbish. So I've got 5 out of the 15 as strikers: Ferguson, Doku, got Diaby.
Oh yeah, you can tell a 7-man league. You can actually build up quite a nice, impressive squad.
Goalies I never worry about. I mean, this in this version of the game, it's always been really strict for defenders. The way the points work, you can go now 97 minutes and be on your clean sheet, and then you concede, and it's a 3-point swing. It's a sickener. Whereas, I heard you talking one of the other ones about the clean sheet rule, and the 75 versus 60 minutes.
Everyone's biggest gripe, yeah.
Yeah, I think the compromise to that is once you get to 75 minutes, your clean sheet's locked in. And then if you concede after 75 minutes, you don't lose all 3 points. You lose 1 point.
But James, that's not how football works.
I know it doesn't.
In the real world, yeah.
But then you could then go, instead of getting 0, you get 2 if you concede 1 after 75 minutes. I think that'd be more fun.
I see.
Because what teams have is they just don't have defenders in as much as they used to. The 70-point defender, I mean, Cancelo is gone. You look at the list of players in like the top 20, other than Trippier, they're all forwards and midfield players. Yeah. So a big up for the defenders, I would say.
Well, one for Neil to politely listen to, smile and nod, say it's interesting in part 3, and then not do anything.
Lock in the clean sheet at 75 minutes, Neil.
Wow, I love it. I love that each week I feel like we get a new rule that will almost certainly never happen. But now we're going to sit here and think of, we'll be going at the weekend like, could have had, if we'd taken the James rule, we could have had 2 points.
I mean, you can see twice in injury time, and you had a clean sheet, you'd still be on 1 point, not -1.
Yeah, look, this is definitely someone talking who had defenders in the Chelsea-Man City game over the weekend. So,
yeah, fair one.
You're not sat in your military uniform anymore. You're now a civvy, as you put it before the call. But you've been, I suppose, Fantasy League is almost one of the longest careers. Well, it's your longest career you've had in your life, and I imagine will go on for many, many years. Can you sum up, whether it's you, other members in your league, really kind of what this game means to you and why you enjoy it so much and why you're still playing it so many years on from your uni days, now having left the Navy as well?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the 2 obvious but definite resonating reasons: competitiveness, natural competitiveness with mates has been something that I've lived and enjoyed for years, and even those that say they're not really competitive often are. So just playing games is a good thing, and the social element to it. In today's world, especially in this phase of our lives, so everybody in our league is 40. Are we in the 50s yet? We're getting there, close, but 40 something. So we're all in that phase of our life where we've got families, jobs, kids, busy phase, and this provides the 1 or 2 touch points a year where we can all, for a little moment, drop that, have a few beers, have a laugh, and pretend we're students again. Whether it's Zoom, actually getting into a pub, you try to do a Christmas meet-up with a few friends, that sort of thing. And when you're watching that game that is 2 teams that you don't support, and one of your Fantasy League players scores, it's like Christmas all over again. It's amazing, and to see, and even more to see the disappointment or anger on somebody else's face is also equally as rewarding. So I guess social side and the competitive kid in me that says, I like playing games.
I think that will resonate with a lot of people who've played Fantasy League over the years. James, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate you giving up your time. And for anyone who would like to come on to the pod to talk about their league, you can get in contact with us, podcast@fantasyleague.co.uk. You can find us on @fantasyleague on various social medias. We'll be back after this.
Right, so as ever, we have Neil Mansfield from head office joining us in part 3. Lots of talking points as we head into this international break on manual assists, points, and even more. But Neil, welcome back. How was your weekend?
Yeah, it was all right, actually. I must say, linking into a previous part of the pod, I do have Cole Palmer.
Neil, what none of these players, obviously you picked up a lot of these players because you weren't at the auction. What were the other managers in your league doing?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I must confess, I didn't pick him up until I think it's the week after he scored. Did he score a goal and got an assist, I think, against Burnley? So I just went in, I think, with a lot of money and picked up Palmer. And since then, I think he's been on fire, hasn't he, in fairness? So I don't know what they were doing. I think a lot of them were asleep this year or clearly been on the beers a little bit too early.
And you're here, Neil, to talk us through, obviously, all the usual stuff. But we also wanted to bring you on to talk about transfers and the players who've been most transferred in, most transferred out. I think it's something that a lot of listeners will be interested to hear. Obviously, for context, there are a lot of leagues out there who do weekly transfer windows. We heard about James in part 2 who does a weekly sealed bids. So there is a lot of movement happening on the site. And it's something that you guys at head office keep a close eye on.
Actually, only really over these last 12 months have we sort of started to take sort of a real interest in the number of transfers that are being made. And that's purely because there are so many different ways that people play the game. Whether they do fortnightly sealed bids or, as you say, sort of a weekly transfer, or whether they just open it up and allow teams to make transfers when they want. I think that's what is so fantastic about the game, the different ways that people play it. I don't really know the best way to do this, but I think probably the fun way would be to see if you can guess the top 3 most transferred out players. Fairly obvious, I would think, but I'll hand it over to you, see if you can have a guess.
So what's the exact time scale on this we're talking?
Over the last week. There might be a little bit of an overlap. Generally look at it over the last week.
James Maddison.
Yeah, Maddison is the name that I would have gone
If
for.
people are getting rid of things weekly and they would have got rid of him, he's going to be out for a while.
So oddly, Maddison doesn't make the top 3. I think people will probably hang on to Maddison because they don't want to risk potentially losing him again when he regains fitness. So rather than chucking him back into the free agents pot, I think a lot of people have hung on to him and are sort of, using their bench a little bit more carefully, hopefully. So he doesn't actually make the top 3 at all. The top 3, in at number 3, I feel like some sort of Radio 1 DJ. In at number 3 is Richarlison, who was transferred out quite a lot. And then obviously you've got a couple of fairly big injuries. You've got Van der Ven in at number 2. In at number 1 is Dan Burn, Newcastle, which I thought was quite an interesting one, I guess, because, Newcastle now have a fairly big injury crisis. Perhaps people are thinking, right, Newcastle are going to start conceding, maybe. Don't really know. Long-term
injury as well, right? It's all sort of injury-based, isn't it? Which I guess is the things that is making people move.
Exactly. So if you started looking at sort of Newcastle players, there's a couple in there that I think may well appear in the most popular transfers in.
Sean Longstaff, because he scored a goal. That's how it tends to work when you're doing weekly transfers, I think, doesn't it? But no, we did talk about last week how they did look like, despite the injury crisis at Newcastle, there were squad players coming in who were showing good value. I think I mentioned Matt Ritchie as one of them, although I think he's down as a defender, so maybe you've got a bit of risk there. But yeah, I would have thought maybe a Sean Longstaff, Ritchie, some of those maybe attacking players who are coming in to replace.
So the top 3 most transferred in players, it's a name that's come up before, so it will make you laugh. Top 3 transferred in is McTominay.
Of course.
Still, people are still picking him up.
Still picking him up, yeah, absolutely. Really high up the list as well. And then we've got a couple of Newcastle players in at number 2 and in at number 1. So I'm going to leave it to you two to see if you can guess who they might be.
Both Newcastle.
Both Newcastle.
Jamal Lascelles.
Do you know Livramento?
Yeah, Lascelles is in at number 2. Yeah, exactly. Well done, Jess. So in at number 1 is Livramento, by actually quite some distance as well.
Interesting. Yeah, obviously those were 2 that came up with obviously in our monthly transfer window, which wrapped up last week, and a fair amount of money was spent on McTominay as well, as it was for Neil Maupay, who I thought maybe would have slipped in to that list.
Well, I don't know whether you're beginning to influence things now with Maupay, because Maupay was just outside the top 3.
There we
he
are.
Came in at number 4. But number 5 for me is the biggest surprise of all. Harry Maguire.
Yeah.
5th most transferred in player.
Aren't Man United technically the most formed team in the league
Of course, yeah, exactly. And people are getting rid of I think, from sort of like the other teams. You are targeting. You are going to have to start targeting who you're going to think is going to finish in the top 8, top 6, 7, 8, and it's making. I almost feel like there are fewer players available because there are teams that you're disregarding. For the first time this month, we do a tally every time we do the transfer window of how many teams are represented from each Premier League club. So basically, Man City and Liverpool are both top distribution in our league. We've got 15 players from each within our league. And for the first time, I think ever, we've got a team, Burnley, where there is not a single Burnley player playing in our league, a league of 10 managers. Luton, there's just one. Bournemouth, there's just one. Sheffield United, there's just 2. I think that puts pressure on some of those other teams to start filling up with squad players or with players who you previously wouldn't have touched, even if they were defenders. It's almost like there are fewer players to pick from.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I had 2 Burnley players at the start, but I was picking from the dregs. And obviously with the announcement around Foster, I will probably move him on this week. And looking at the sort of the wider transfers, you've got more of the teams that you highlight. You've got 3 Palace players, all defenders, in the top 12 transferred in. So I think that does sort of highlight the point quite nicely. Even an Evertonian or 2 coming in there as well.
Well, that's interesting. We're going to keep tabs on that throughout the season, Neil. If you keep bringing us the stats, we'll keep guessing. We were quite good at the guessing this week, but we'll be able to keep guessing and maybe also continue to influence all you out there on who you should be bringing in and out.
Bring the fantasy league world down by starting to influence players we don't think are very good.
And therefore maybe bring the real, perhaps won't really extend into the real world, but we'll see. Maybe one day we'll have that great influence. But Neil, talking of influence, we're here to talk about manual assists and points as well. And there were a couple of manual assists, I wouldn't say controversies, but talking points certainly over the weekend. There were a few players, a few fantasy league managers who got in touch. Clint Diaz, Joel Stanley, James Shepherd, all believe Jesse's Moussa Diaby should have been given an assist over the weekend rather than Yuri Tielemans.
Joining this campaign.
Yeah.
I don't see why, personally, it wasn't something that I thought, but I will join this campaign to get more points. So Neil, sort it out.
Clear it up, Neil.
Right, well, I don't think he was. I think first and foremost, neither Opta nor the BBC gave Diaby an assist at all. So kudos, I think in particular to James, who was on Twitter talking about how Opta have it down as a 0.6 XG chance for Diaby. Having said that, if they were absolutely adamant that he touched it, then Opta would have awarded it as an automatic assist. They didn't. And I've had a look at this, sort of trying my best to see whether or not Diaby, we freeze framed it, we revert, whatever the angles aren't brilliant. Yeah. On the lines, we've drawn the lines. Yeah, they're in, and I just can't see it. So we're sticking with the on-field decision.
Check complete.
Tielemans gets the assist, and I think it's check complete exactly. You know what? I think it's really important as well that we don't reference FPL. I love the way that everyone sort of says, "Oh, look, but FPL have awarded it." I don't care. I don't care whether FPL have awarded it because different rules, different game, and ultimately you're in a different league, aren't you, right?
Oh, very good, Neil. Well done.
So, no, Tielemans keeps the assist.
And it's good for Tielemans to get points. He's an old favourite of mine, and it's good that he's starting to play for Villa now and starting to get some points. Maybe he's one to target. We've also had a question in from Tommy Key on Twitter /X saying that someone in our league owns Tottenham's Bissouma. No one likes him, is what he's written. Oh, no one likes the person who owns Bissouma as opposed to I don't know whether they like or dislike Bissouma, but that wasn't a reference to Bissouma. Okay, we were watching the Spurs match and we think Bissouma left the pitch on 74.58. Pedantic, I know, but we don't think he should get the 2 points for a clean sheet. Now, obviously, if it was 74.58, that would mean that he wouldn't get the 2 points for a clean sheet because you have to have played 75 minutes. But Neil, you've gone back into the head office VAR equivalent room and you've rewound the clock. What minute and second did Bissouma come off, and therefore did he or did he not earn a 75 minutes played clean sheet for Tottenham Hotspur?
Well, as you all know, it is definitely completing 75 minutes. He's going to be absolutely gutted because the official statistical breakdown has him completing it by a second. So 75 minutes and 1 second
Wow.
is the official timing statistical breakdown by Opta. So I'm afraid no matter how much you either hate Basuma or the player who has Basuma, he still gets his clean sheets.
Yeah, well, Ange knew that he'd let down a lot of fantasy league managers out there. He had to do something to help them out.
I'm so intrigued how Opta decide that. Is it when... Are they like zooming in for when the foot is off? You know, do you need both feet off the pitch? Or is it when the ref sort of stops play for the sub to be made?
It's true.
I feel like we need to get the stats nerds finding the exact definition
maybe they
of
do
when
need
you've left the pitch.
They do need to get the lines out, maybe, and see exactly.
I feel like that, exactly. I feel like, did his foot appear onto the pitch or off the pitch or on the pitch at exactly that second? It feels like a call into our Opta account manager is due next week to get some clarity on it.
We need Gary Neville with a football boot showing you different angles of how it can look like the football boot is on or off the pitch.
Absolutely. But is it when he comes off the pitch, or is it the moment that his number is raised and that's when he's got to come on? No, I shall find out if I can.
No, it might come to a surprise. They obviously, Tommy's league, they obviously have defensive points for midfielders, which is why he would earn a clean sheet if there's anyone confused out there, as I was just now, as to why Basuma would get clean sheet points at all. But they've obviously customised their league to make that a rule. And Neil, in part, I mean, we don't need to really go into this because we know what the answer is. It was a bit preposterous from such a brilliant part 2 with James. The one moment he slipped up was when he requested that you should get the point, even if you get to 75 minutes as a defender, you get your clean sheet points, and even if your team concedes after 75 points, you should still get clean. You know, should maybe get downgraded to 2. And as we pointed out to him, I mean, that's not how football works. You know, just because you get to 75, it doesn't mean that you're going to get. Oh, yeah, we'll give you some points. You know, conceding a goal is conceding a goal. If you're on the pitch, you conceded that goal.
Hey, look, I think the thing here is that we've had the same rules for quite some time. So I think the question really is, are there rules? I think this is something that perhaps, listeners should get in touch with. Are there rules that people will want to see change for next season? Are there changes that, people would want implemented, that we can discuss as a wider community to see whether or not, it's worth bringing in? And those could be wide ranging from, minutes on the pitch, which I think we've talked about before. So I think we'll put that out as a wide email to everyone. But we're not against changing things here. I think as long as we can and they're sensible and they make sense, and there's a vast majority of people want them, not sort of a handful of people who are gutted that Basuma missed or gained his clean sheets by a second. Then I think it's worthwhile looking at. So yeah, send in your ideas. Whether it's an email into the podcast team or address it on Twitter. Happy to pick it up.
There is one that we can perhaps discuss. We don't have to go into it now, but one to think about. I think it's one that Jesse and I both agreed could and maybe should happen when you were up on your mountain a couple of weeks ago. But over the weekend, scored a penalty for Crystal Palace, but also conceded the foul. And even in my league, Johnny said, "Oh, have they not updated the manual assist? Because I should be getting 5 points from that." And I said, "No, Johnny, it doesn't work like that. If you get fouled, you'll only get the goal points." That's one, I think, which could have good reasoning to be adjusted. But maybe you disagree.
Haaland at the weekend, exactly the same incident. Exactly. He was brought down, I think, in a box. So that was
brought down in inverted commas.
Yeah, absolutely, brought down. He's a small guy, isn't he, Haaland? Easily falls over. I think it's always been like that, in terms of, if you earn the penalty and take the penalty, then you don't get both points. But yeah, I mean, I'm not against that at all. I think that might be a nice way of changing around. It's within our control as well in terms of, it's just a manual adjustment. So that's quite easy to do as a rule change.
Okay, great. So
listen, we were trendsetters when it came to Fantasy League. We could be trendsetters with all of football. Who knows?
Exactly.
Yeah, well, exactly. I love the fact that everyone references FPL. I really love the fact that we have our own rules. We don't follow, FPL in terms of, the way they adhere to their ridiculous point system. So we do have our own way of applying. I think that is the overarching takeaway from today.
Brilliant. Well, as ever, if anything you want to discuss, you know where to come. Contact us on @FantasyLeague on social media. You can also reach us by email if you've got a really long monologue that you want to get off your chest, podcast@fantasyleague.com. football.co.uk. We're desperate to hear from you, how things are getting on in your league, what rule changes you think should happen, which probably won't end up happening. And anything more you've got for Neil, please do get in touch. So next week it's the international break. There's plenty to discuss though in Fantasy League land. We'll be looking ahead and looking behind as we usually do. And we've got a question of sport themed quiz. The man who writes the questions for the TV show has got some questions specially designed for Jesse and I. So please do tune in as you usually do. This week, thank you Neil, thank you Jesse, thank you James in part 2, and thank you producer Simon as ever. And we'll see you next week.